Confession is supposed to mean telling the truth about something you've kept hidden, something you're ashamed of, afraid of, or simply unable to carry alone anymore. Some of them may have explanations, some don't. And in a few cases, the most unsettling part isn't what happened, but the fact that somebody lived with it long enough to finally tell another person. If you enjoy disturbing confessions, strange real-life style stories, and the darker corners of Reddit, subscribe to the channel. There are plenty more stories like these coming. And with that, let's get into the first funeral was for a man named Michael Bell. And what I remember most clearly is his mother arguing with the funeral director about his tie. She wanted the blue one because Michael had worn it to his sister's wedding. The funeral director thought charcoal would photograph better. I was standing a few feet away with my stole folded over one arm, listening to two grieving people discuss something that would normally have meant nothing to me, while trying not to think about a voice I had heard 3 nights earlier through a wooden screen. I served as a Catholic priest for a little over 30 years, most of them in ordinary suburban parishes where the work was less dramatic than people imagine. I celebrated Mass, visited hospitals, went to too many committee meetings, signed school forms, heard complaints about parking and thermostats, and spent a surprising amount of time deciding whether someone could store folding chairs in a room already full of folding chairs. I heard confessions every week. Most were brief and familiar enough that the people making them probably could have exchanged places without changing many of the words. Anger at spouses, pornography, drinking, resentment, affairs, lies, cruelty toward children, cruelty toward parents, things stolen, things wished for, things done because somebody was lonely and ashamed of being lonely. You become difficult to shock after enough years, though that is different from becoming indifferent. The point was never to rank sins according to how interesting I found them. My job was to listen to a person who had come asking for reconciliation, determine as best I could whether they meant it, give counsel when it was useful, and avoid turning the sacrament into either therapy or interrogation. The man who came that Wednesday night did not ask for reconciliation. Our church was old enough that the confessionals still had separate doors, with the priest in the center and penitents entering small compartments on either side. We had face-to-face confession available too, but some people preferred the screen. I did myself, especially with strangers. It gave both of us a little privacy. He entered during the last 20 minutes before evening mass. I never saw his face. He began in the usual way and then stopped. I could hear his breathing, not frightened or hurried, just patient. I asked how long it had been since his last confession. A long time. I told him that was all right. He said, I killed someone on Monday. I had heard people confess violence before. Some used words loosely. A man once told me he had killed his marriage because he cheated. Another said he was responsible for his father's death because he had not convinced him to stop smoking. I asked this man what he meant. I mean, he was alive. And then because of something I did, he wasn't. There was no tremor in his voice. I waited because people often continue when silence is allowed to sit for a moment. He told me the dead man lived alone and that most people would believe he had taken his own life. He did not describe exactly how he had done it, and I am not going to fill in those gaps here. What mattered to him was that the death would not look suspicious. He had arranged enough of the circumstances, he said, that the police would see a lonely man with personal problems rather than another person having been in the house. I interrupted him and asked whether this was something that had actually happened. Yes. Then you need to go to the police. I thought you'd say that. You need to surrender yourself. He gave a small laugh. I told him I could not absolve someone who had no intention of stopping what he was doing or accepting responsibility. I remember the words coming out more sharply than I intended. There are moments when a priest is supposed to remain calm because the person sitting on the other side of the screen may be frightened, mentally ill, intoxicated, or simply incapable of explaining themselves well. I was aware of all that, but the man's calmness bothered me. He said, I didn't ask for absolution. I had no answer ready for that. He continued talking about the dead man in a way I disliked immediately. He didn't tell me his name, address, or occupation. Instead, he gave me ordinary pieces of him. The man had kept his work boots beside the back door, even after retiring. He bought canned food for a stray cat that wouldn't let him touch it. His kitchen clock was 12 minutes fast because he had set it that way years earlier and never changed it back. He liked baseball on the radio and kept the volume low. Those details made the confession worse because they had no obvious purpose. They weren't evidence. They weren't necessary to admit the killing. The man on the other side of the screen simply wanted another person to know that the dead man had existed in specific little ways. I told him again to go to the police. No. Then why are you here? He waited so long that I thought he might have left. Eventually he said, because somebody should know. I told him that confession was not a place to store secrets he wanted another person forced to carry. He answered, isn't that exactly what it is? I ended the confession after that. I didn't give absolution. I told him again that he needed to turn himself in, and that if he returned seeking confession, he needed to come prepared to stop what he was doing. He left without arguing. I celebrate at Mass 20 minutes later. There were 19 people in the church. I remember that because I counted them while waiting for the lector to finish the first reading. One of our older parishioners had brought her grandson, who spent most of Mass quietly peeling the label off a bottle of water. A couple near the front whispered during the homily. Somebody had left a grocery receipt inside one of the hymnals. Nothing about the room looked different because a man had just told me he had killed someone. That was one of the hardest parts of priesthood in general. You could hear a person describe the worst thing they had ever done, step out of the confessional, and immediately be asked whether the boiler had been repaired. 3 days later, our parish secretary, Teresa, called me at the rectory and said Michael Bell had died. I knew Michael only casually. He was 58 and attended Mass with his mother 2 or 3 Sundays a month. I had spoken to him at parish breakfasts and once helped him move a table into his mother's garage after a fundraiser. He was friendly without being particularly social, the type of man who stayed after events to stack chairs but disappeared before people started thanking volunteers. Teresa told me the family believed he had taken his own life. I sat at my kitchen table with the telephone against my ear and looked at the half of a tuna sandwich I had been eating. She asked whether I was still there. Yes, his mother wants the funeral here. Of course, she asked for you. I told her I would call the family. I did not immediately connect Michael with the man described in confession. There are thousands of retired men who own work boots and listen to baseball. Michael's mother had mentioned that he lived alone, but I knew very little about his home. The connection happened later that afternoon. I visited Mrs. Bell at her daughter's house. Their kitchen was full of the food people bring when somebody dies, because nobody knows what else to bring. There were aluminum trays stacked in the refrigerator and 2 cakes on the counter. Mrs. Bell kept apologizing because she couldn't remember who had sent which one. We discussed readings, music, and whether Michael would be buried or cremated. His sister asked whether the church would still bury someone who had died by suicide, and I told her yes. She cried when I said it. At some point, Mrs. Bell complained that nobody had gone to Michael's house to feed the cat. His sister said, "It's not his cat, Mom. He fed it every day. It lives outside. It still needs to eat." I remember looking down at the funeral planning sheet because I did not want them to see my face. Mrs. Bell continued talking. She said Michael had started buying the animal expensive canned food, even though it wouldn't come close enough to be touched. My hands went cold. Nothing dramatic happened. I did not suddenly know with perfect certainty that the man in confession had killed Michael. I simply sat in a kitchen with a dead man's family and understood that something I had been told privately might belong to the life they were grieving. His sister asked whether I was all right. I said I was tired. We continued planning the funeral. That evening, I spent much longer than usual washing dishes in the rectory kitchen. I wasn't thinking through theories or wondering how to catch the man. I was trying very hard not to think at all, which for me usually meant finding something ordinary that could be completed with my hands. I washed a plate that was already clean, wiped the counter, and took the garbage outside even though the bag was nearly empty. I knew what the seal of confession required of me. There wasn't confusion about that. I could encourage a penitent to surrender. I could refuse absolution when there was no repentance. I could end an abusive confession. What I could not do was repeat what had been confessed to me or identify the person through information learned there. Knowing the rule did not make carrying it pleasant. The funeral was on Monday. Michael's mother chose the blue tie. His sister gave me a page of notes about him because she was worried I would make the homily too religious and forget to talk about her brother as a person. That made me laugh despite everything. She had written down that he hated mushrooms, coached Little League for 6 years, called his mother every Sunday evening, and once drove 7 hours to help his sister replace a broken water heater because her husband was overseas. I used some of it. After the service, people gathered in the parish hall and ate sandwiches from the grocery store. I stood beside Mrs. Bell while she repeated the same stories to people who had already heard them. I shook hands, accepted compliments I didn't want, and watched a little girl steal the frosting flour from a cake before her mother noticed. The following Saturday, I almost asked another priest to hear confessions for me. I didn't. I told myself that changing the schedule because of one disturbed man would be unfair to everyone else. That sounds sensible now, but at the time the truth was simpler. I didn't want to explain why I suddenly couldn't sit in that room. Most of the confessions that afternoon were ordinary. Then someone entered the compartment on my right. He didn't begin with the usual prayer. He said, his mother chose the blue one. I knew the voice immediately. My mouth went dry. He continued before I answered. The charcoal one would have looked better. I told him to leave. You gave a nice homily. Leave. You made him sound happier than he was. I opened my side of the confessional and stood. He remained behind the screen. I told him that if he had come to confess, then he needed to confess honestly, show contrition, and accept that he could not continue killing people. If he had come simply to tell me things because he enjoyed forcing another person to hear them, then he was abusing the sacrament, and I would not participate. He was silent for several seconds. Then he said, I wanted to see what it was like for you. I asked what he meant. To stand there with his family. I stepped out of the confessional. By the time I reached the other door, it was open. There were several people waiting along the back wall of the church, and any one of the men walking toward the exit could have been him. I did not follow. That decision has bothered me more than almost anything else. Not because I know following him would have solved anything. I don't. I simply remember standing there in my black shirt and collar, watching the church doors close behind a stranger, while a woman waiting for confession smiled at me and asked whether everything was all right. I told her yes. Then I went back inside and heard the next confession. For a few months after Michael Bell's funeral, the man didn't come back. I expected him every Saturday. That became its own kind of routine. I would sit down in the confessional, hear the small wooden door open, listen to someone settle onto the kneeler, and wait for the first words. Most voices became recognizable quickly. There was Mrs. Kavanaugh, who worried that being irritated with her daughter-in-law was a mortal sin. There was a man who confessed missing Mass almost every month, even though I saw him at Mass more often than most people. Teenagers often arrived sounding as though their parents had driven them there and instructed them not to come out too quickly. Ordinary people began frightening me for a few seconds simply because they entered quietly. I disliked what that did to the sacrament. It made me impatient in ways I hadn't been before. If somebody paused too long, I wanted them to speak. If an unfamiliar man entered, I caught myself listening to his breathing before I listened to his words. None of that lasted once a normal confession began, but the few seconds beforehand became something I dreaded. Teresa noticed that I had begun leaving immediately when the scheduled hour ended, instead of remaining for late arrivals. She had worked at the parish longer than I had, and treated every priest assigned there as a temporary employee she had been asked to supervise. She was in her 60s, smoked behind the maintenance shed, despite the fact that everyone knew, and had no patience for priests pretending not to be tired. One Tuesday, she came into my office carrying envelopes and asked whether I had developed a bladder problem. No. You leave confession like the building's on fire now. I have things to do. You live next door. I told her to put the envelopes on my desk. She did, but she didn't leave. Something bothering you? No. Teresa gave me the expression she reserved for answers she knew were false, but didn't consider worth fighting about. Fine. The food pantry needs peanut butter. That was the end of it. I became grateful for people like Teresa because she never required me to turn ordinary problems into spiritual ones. If the freezer stopped working, she wanted it repaired. If someone donated 40 cans of cranberry sauce in March, she wanted to know where to put them. One afternoon, we spent almost an hour arguing about whether the parish needed another coffee urn. I remember thinking afterward that I had enjoyed the argument. Spring passed, then most of summer. Michael's mother continued attending Mass. Sometimes I saw her before the service and thought about the blue tie, but usually she wanted to tell me about her knee or show me a photograph of her great-grandson. People continued living around Michael's absence because there were prescriptions to refill, grandchildren to babysit, lawns to mow, and parish breakfasts that still needed someone to bring orange juice. I began to think perhaps the man had stopped. Then he returned in August. It was unusually hot that afternoon, and the air conditioning inside the church wasn't keeping up. I had loosened my collar before confession began and was already thinking about the bottle of water I had forgotten in the rectory when somebody entered the compartment beside me. His first words were, "I did it again." I recognized the voice immediately. I told him to stop. "I already did. You know what I mean." He said he did. He began describing a woman, Agan. He did not give me her name. He told me she collected ceramic birds and hated having her photograph taken. She kept emergency cash hidden somewhere in her kitchen because she distrusted banks. She left television news running throughout the day, even when she was in another room, because she disliked an empty house. I asked whether she was dead. Yes. Then go to the police. No. There will be no absolution. I know. I had expected that answer and still felt anger when he gave it. Why are you here? The silence lasted long enough that I could hear somebody moving in the church outside. Finally, he said, "Because you're the only person I can tell. You can tell a police officer. I can't tell them and still go home." There was nothing theological about what he was doing. He understood the situation perfectly well. He had found a person he could speak to who could not later become an ordinary witness against him. I told him I would not continue listening if that was why he came. Then don't. He stopped speaking. I waited for him to continue, but he didn't. After perhaps a minute, I opened my door and left the confessional. When I walked around to the other side, his compartment was empty. For the next 2 weeks, nothing happened that I could connect to what he had said. Then Teresa told me Helen Novak had died. I knew Helen better than I had known Michael. She volunteered at our food pantry every second Thursday and had strong opinions about what counted as a charitable donation. According to Helen, canned peas were not generosity. They were what people gave away when they cleaned out the part of their pantry nobody wanted. She also owned ceramic birds. I knew because I had visited her home after surgery the previous winter and nearly knocked one from a table with my coat. It was a blue jay with a chipped tail. Helen caught it before it fell and informed me that if I broke it, She expected a replacement of equal or greater ugliness. Her death had apparently been treated as an accident at home. That was all I allowed myself to learn. Her nephew asked whether I would celebrate the funeral. I almost told him another priest should do it, but Helen had attended our parish for years, and I had known her. Refusing would have required an explanation I could not give. The funeral was small. Helen had no children and had outlived many of her friends. Her nephew brought several photographs to the parish hall, and, for reasons I never understood, 3 of her ceramic birds. The blue jay with the chipped tail was one of them. That bothered me far more than it should have. I kept looking at it while people ate. Her nephew told me stories I hadn't heard before. Helen had once driven to Kentucky to pick him up after his car broke down, because he was too embarrassed to call his parents. She had secretly paid a neighbor's heating bill one winter and then denied it when the neighbor found out. She hated jazz and loved baseball, although according to her nephew, she understood almost none of the rules. None of those things mattered to what had happened to her. I was still glad to hear them. After the luncheon, Teresa found me wrapping leftover cookies in plastic. "You're doing that wrong. I'm wrapping cookies. You've individually wrapped 11 cookies." I looked down. She was right. Teresa took the plastic wrap away from me. "Go home. I'm fine. You have been telling people you're fine since before I started here, and I've worked here 22 years. I laughed, mostly because she looked angry enough to throw the cookies at me. That seemed to satisfy her. I went back to the rectory and ate 2 of Helen's funeral cookies for dinner. The man returned the following Saturday. This time I recognized him before he said anything because I had become familiar with the way he breathed when he was waiting for me to speak. I told him I would not hear him. "You knew her." I stood up. "So did I." I stopped. That was all he needed. He told me Helen had once shouted at him in a grocery store parking lot after he left a shopping cart beside her car. She had called him lazy. I asked whether that was why he killed her. "No." "Then why?" He was quiet. "I don't know." His answer made me sit down again. I had spent enough years listening to people explain terrible behavior that I had become accustomed to motives, even pathetic ones. Anger, humiliation, jealousy, money, sex, revenge, fear. Sometimes the motive was absurd compared with what somebody had done, but they usually had one. He sounded as if I had asked why he had chosen a particular shirt. I told him there was no reason for him to be in confession if he did not want forgiveness. I like that someone knows. I don't want to know. I know. That was the point at which I finally understood that my distress was part of what he was coming for. I ended the confession. That afternoon, I drove to my sister Anne's house in Columbus. I hadn't planned the trip. I called her from the highway and asked whether she was home. She said she had 2 grandchildren over, and the place looked like a daycare after a tornado. I told her that sounded fine. Anne never called me father unless she was making fun of me. I became her younger brother as soon as I walked inside. Within 10 minutes, she had put a knife in my hand and told me to cut strawberries while the children argued over a television remote. She asked why I had driven nearly 2 hours without warning. I wanted dinner. "You own food, not good food. You've been living alone too long." We ate hamburgers in the backyard. Her husband accused me of cheating at cards after I beat him twice. One of the children spilled lemonade down the front of my pants. Anne complained about a neighbor who had replaced a perfectly good wooden fence with white vinyl and had apparently committed a crime against civilization. By doing so, nobody asked me about confession. Nobody died. Nobody needed absolution. For a few hours, I was only somebody's brother and uncle. On the drive back, the relief disappeared before I reached the highway. I knew I would eventually have to sit in the confessional again. That became the real damage the man did. I wasn't afraid he would kill me. He had never threatened me, and nothing he said suggested I was one of the people he wanted dead. Instead, I became afraid of knowing ordinary things about people. A parishioner mentioned that her husband repaired antique radios, and I wished she hadn't told me. Another joked that he never remembered to lock his garage, and I wanted to tell him not to say things like that where strangers could hear. During hospital visits, I noticed who lived alone because family members weren't sitting beside their beds. I did not start researching anyone. I did not search newspapers for deaths matching his descriptions. I did not follow unfamiliar men after Mass. If anything, I did less. I became a poorer listener. People would tell me something harmless about themselves, and part of me wanted them to stop before the detail became something I might hear again through a screen. The man stayed away for almost 6 months. By January, I had started enjoying confession again. Not exactly as I had before, but enough that I stopped watching the clock. Then, one Saturday in February, he returned. His first words were, "This one isn't dead yet." I gripped the edge of the chair. He said he had chosen someone. I interrupted him. "I am not listening to this." "You already are." I stood and opened my door. He spoke faster. "She'll be alone Tuesday." I stepped outside. His voice continued from behind the wooden partition. He described a woman who walked with a cane but frequently forgot it in restaurants. She kept peppermint candies in the pockets of her coat. She owned a small dog that barked at nearly everyone except children. I walked away before he finished. Several people were waiting along the back of the church. An elderly woman near the front of the line smiled when she saw me. It was Mrs. Kavanaugh. She reached into her coat pocket. "Father, would you like a peppermint?" I stood there staring at the candy in her palm. Mrs. Kavanaugh laughed. "You look like you've seen a ghost." I had known her for years. She walked with a cane. She owned a terrier that hated me, but tolerated every child who came near it. I took the peppermint because refusing it would have required an explanation. She entered the confessional. I remained in the aisle for a moment, trying to decide whether I could go back inside and hear her confession, while wondering whether a murderer had just told me she would be alone on Tuesday. Then I returned to my seat. Mrs. Kavanaugh began in the usual way. I listened. Mrs. Kavanaugh did not die on Tuesday. I know because she called the parish office Wednesday morning to complain that someone had changed the time of the senior luncheon without telling her. Teresa transferred the call to me because, in her words, I was the one who had approved the schedule change and therefore deserved whatever followed. Mrs. Kavanaugh spent nearly 10 minutes explaining why moving lunch from noon to 11:30 created an unnecessary hardship for civilized people. I barely listened. I was too relieved to hear her voice. When she finished, she asked whether I was still there. "Yes, you sound strange. I'm tired." "You priests are always tired. You should get married so someone can tell you when to go to bed." I laughed and promised to look into the luncheon schedule. After I hung up, I sat at my desk longer than I needed to. I did not call Mrs. Kavanaugh back and ask where she had been Tuesday. I did not ask whether she had spent the day alone or whether anybody unfamiliar had approached her. I did not tell her to change her locks, stay with relatives, or stop walking the dog by herself. People may read that and think I failed her. Perhaps I did. At the time, every possible action felt tied to the way I had learned about the threat. I had spent most of my adult life accepting that some parts of priesthood were not mine to redesign simply because they became painful. The seal of confession was one of those things. I knew what I was permitted to do inside the confessional. I knew what I was not permitted to reveal outside it. What I did not know was how to live normally once somebody began using that certainty against me. So I followed the rule. I went to the senior luncheon the next week and helped Mrs. Kavanaugh carry her tray because she had forgotten her cane in the parish hall again. Her dog was not there because dogs were not allowed in the building, though she spent several minutes telling me that this was discrimination against animals with better manners than most parishioners. Nothing happened to her. The man stayed away for 3 weeks. When he returned, I knew him by the silence before he spoke. I changed my mind. I did not answer. About the woman. I kept my hands folded in my lap. She wasn't right. I had promised myself I would leave immediately if he came back, but I heard myself ask, "What does that mean?" He seemed pleased that I had responded. She reminded me of someone after I watched her for a while. My stomach tightened. You watched her? For a few days. I stood. He continued before I reached the door. You were worried about your parishioner. I stopped with my hand on the latch. He laughed softly. Was it the peppermint? I remember exactly how embarrassed I felt. Not frightened. Embarrassed. He had known. Maybe he had seen Mrs. Kavanaugh at church. Maybe he knew her habits because he had followed her. Maybe every detail he had given me had been selected because he knew I would recognize her. I could not tell which possibility was worse, and I suddenly understood that trying to distinguish between them was giving him another thing he wanted. I opened the door. Behind me, he said, "It wasn't her." I stopped again. I hate that I stopped. He had offered relief, and my body accepted it before the rest of me could object. "It was never her," he continued. "I saw you talking to her after Mass once. I wondered what you'd do." I turned toward the screen even though I still could not see him. "You are using this." There was a pause. "Yes. You are not confessing." "No. You have no intention of repentance." "No. You are not here because you want forgiveness." "No." For months, I had kept trying to fit what he did into a sacramental structure because that was the structure available to me. I had refused absolution. I had told him to surrender. I had ended confessions. None of it mattered because he had never cared about absolution. I asked him what he wanted. His answer came quickly. "You." I must have reacted because he corrected himself. Not like that. I remained standing. I wanted someone who had to keep listening. "I don't. You did." "No. I can end this, but you can't undo it." I walked out. There were 4 people waiting in the church. I told them confession was canceled because I was ill. That was not difficult to believe. The following morning, I told our pastor I could no longer hear scheduled confessions for a while. He was younger than me by almost 15 years, and generally knew when not to challenge an older priest who had already made up his mind. Still, he asked whether something had happened. Yes. Do I need to know? I thought about that question. No. He accepted it. I expected to feel relieved after giving up the confessional. For a while, I did. I celebrated Mass, visited parishioners in the hospital, attended finance meetings, performed baptisms, and spent an afternoon mediating an argument between 2 women who both believed the other had intentionally changed the flowers on the Marian altar. I began sleeping better. Teresa stopped asking whether I was sick. Ordinary work reclaimed most of my attention. Then, 2 months later, a man was found dead in a town about 8 miles away. I did not know him. Our pastor mentioned it while we were eating breakfast because the dead man's family belonged to another Catholic parish, and that priest had called asking about funeral arrangements. I asked the man's name. It meant nothing to me. Our pastor told me he had been found alone at home and that police were investigating. I buttered a piece of toast and waited without wanting to admit what I was waiting for. No ceramic birds. No stray cat. No peppermint candy. No detail from an old confession reached across the table and attached itself to the dead man. I felt relieved. That feeling ashamed me more than the murder frightened me. A week later, the local news reported that police believed the death was suspicious. I did not read further. I had reached a point where not knowing felt like the only decision still available to me. The man did not return. Months passed. Eventually, I began hearing confessions again, though never every Saturday. The first few times I found myself listening for him, but ordinary human embarrassment has a way of taking up space. A teenager confessed cheating on an exam and then spent 5 minutes explaining why the teacher was partly responsible. An elderly man confessed that he deliberately parked across 2 spaces because young people drove too fast. A woman cried because she had told her sister she hated her and could not remember whether she had meant it. I was surprised by how much I had missed those people. Not their sins, their messiness. The man who had been coming to me spoke as though every detail about another person could be stripped from them and carried into the confessional as an object. With ordinary penitents, details stayed attached to lives. A lie belonged to a marriage. Anger belonged to a family. Shame belonged to something a person wanted to repair, or at least stop repeating. That difference helped. I was transferred the following year. Priests get transferred for ordinary reasons, and mine was no exception. The bishop needed someone experienced at a smaller parish outside Dayton. My health was good, the pastor there was approaching retirement, and I had been in my current assignment long enough that nobody considered the move unusual. Teresa organized my farewell dinner without asking me. She gave me a coffee mug that said, "My favorite parish secretary." "You bought this yourself?" "Yes. So technically it says you're your own favorite parish secretary." "I'm everyone's favorite parish secretary." She hugged me before I left, which surprised both of us. Michael Bell's mother had died by then. Helen Novak's nephew sent me a Christmas card once. Mrs. Kavanaugh was still alive and still angry about scheduling. The new parish was quieter. There was no school attached to it, fewer weddings and far fewer committee meetings. I liked the slower pace more than I expected. The confessions stopped occupying my mind every day. They never disappeared completely. Almost 4 years after I last heard the man's voice, I saw his face in a newspaper. I was eating lunch in a diner near the parish after a hospital visit. The newspaper had been left folded beside the sugar packets, and I noticed a photograph beneath a headline about an arrest connected to several deaths in 3 counties. I unfolded the paper. The man in the photograph was in his 40s, maybe early 50s. He had glasses, thinning hair, and the sort of face I would have forgotten 5 minutes after seeing him in a grocery store. I did not recognize him. For years, I had imagined that if I ever saw the man, I would know immediately. I knew his voice. I knew the way he paused before answering questions. I knew how he breathed behind a wooden partition. His face meant nothing to me. I read the article. The police had arrested him after an investigation into the death of a former coworker. Evidence from that case had apparently caused investigators to review several earlier deaths originally classified as accidents or suicides. 2 names appeared near the end: Michael Bell, Helen Novak. I stopped reading. The waitress came over and asked whether I wanted more coffee. I said yes. She filled the cup and asked if I was all right. I told her I was. That habit had survived Teresa. I folded the newspaper and left it on the table. I did not contact the police. By then, they clearly had reasons of their own to connect Michael and Helen to the man. They did not need anything from me, and I could not give them what he had told me. The case went to trial. I followed very little of it. A priest I knew called once because he had seen the names and remembered Michael Bell from my old parish. He asked whether I had known any of the victims. I told him yes. He started discussing the case, but I changed the subject. People assume I must have wanted answers. I didn't. I already had more of him than I wanted. I eventually heard that he was convicted of several murders. Some deaths were suspected but never charged. I never learned whether every killing he described to me was real. I never learned whether the woman with the cane and the peppermint candies existed, or whether he had created her entirely to manipulate me. I never learned why he chose Michael or Helen. I could have read enough to form opinions. I chose not to. There was one thing he had told me that I believed without needing a trial. He liked that somebody knew. It took me years to admit what that meant for me. People usually entered confession because they wanted to leave something behind. They wanted forgiveness, peace, permission to start again, or sometimes simply the relief of admitting something they had hidden too long. He came for the opposite reason. He wanted to leave carrying exactly what he had brought in. I was the one who had to keep it. For a long time, I blamed myself for not recognizing that sooner. I replayed the first confession and imagined ending it earlier. I imagined following him out of the church. I imagined changing schedules, refusing to hear him again, doing something different when Mrs. Kavanaugh offered me that peppermint. Eventually, those imaginary versions became another way of allowing him into my life, so I stopped rehearsing them. I tried instead to remember Michael as his family remembered him. Work boots by the door, baseball on the radio, a man who stayed after parish events to stack chairs. I remembered Helen complaining about canned peas and nearly making me buy her a replacement ceramic bird. I remembered Mrs. Kavanaugh getting angry about lunch being moved 30 minutes. Those memories belonged to them before they belonged to him. I retired from active ministry several years later. The confession was not the reason. There were health issues, exhaustion, family obligations, and the ordinary accumulation of 30 years spent being available whenever someone else was sick, dying, frightened, or getting married. I still believe in confession. I know some people reading this will find that difficult to understand. What happened did not make me believe less in the value of being heard. It made me more careful about what listening can become. Last year, I attended the funeral of an old seminary friend. I sat in the pew instead of near the altar. Another priest celebrated the Mass, and for once I was not responsible for making sure the readings were marked correctly. The family knew where to stand, or the funeral director had remembered the incense. Afterward, there was too much food in the parish hall. Two men argued about where to stack folding chairs. Someone dropped a spoon into a bowl of potato salad and left it there. For the first time in years, I found myself enjoying the fact that none of it was my problem. As I was leaving, an elderly man stopped me outside the church. Someone had apparently told him I used to be a priest. "Father?" I told him I wasn't father anymore. He apologized. Then he asked whether he could tell me something anyway. I almost said no. He saw something in my face and smiled. "It's nothing terrible. I just don't have anyone to talk to." We sat on a bench near the parking lot. His wife had died the year before. Since then, he had been learning how to cook for himself. He kept buying groceries for 2 people and only realized it when he reached the register. He told me his wife had hated bananas. So for 43 years, he had rarely bought them. Now he bought a bunch every week and usually let half of them rot, because apparently he didn't like bananas either. He laughed when he told me that. I did too. He talked for about 15 minutes. I did not ask questions unless I needed to understand something. I did not give advice. He never asked me what he should do. When he finished, he thanked me and walked to his car. I stayed on the bench for a while after he left. Eventually, I got up and went back inside because I had forgotten my coat in the parish hall. The men had finished arguing about the chairs and stacked them against the wrong wall anyway. I moved one out of the doorway so nobody would trip over it. Then I took my coat and went home. The first time somebody thanked me for something I hadn't done, I thought she was being sarcastic. Her name was Nina, and we worked together at a medical supply warehouse outside Indianapolis. She handled receiving on the morning shift. I worked inventory control, which meant I spent most of my day walking around with a scanner, fixing quantities that never matched what the computer said we had, and explaining to supervisors that no, I could not make 12 missing cases of sterile tubing materialize by refreshing the screen. Nina stopped me near the vending machines one Monday and held up a Dunkin' cup. "You're a lifesaver." I had no idea what she meant, so I looked at the coffee. She laughed. For Friday. Friday had been my day off. I wasn't here Friday. I know. That's why it was nice. She reminded me that her daughter had been sick and that she had needed to leave early. Apparently, I had arranged for somebody from inventory to cover the last hour of receiving so she wouldn't get an attendance point. I told her she had the wrong person. "No, it was you." It definitely wasn't. "You told Marcus to cover me." Marcus was one of the warehouse leads. I rarely spoke to him unless something had been put in the wrong location. I didn't talk to Marcus. Nina gave me a look that suggested I was making a strange joke, then shrugged. Well, whoever did it, thank you. She walked away before I could answer. I forgot about it within an hour. The warehouse employed around 70 people across 2 shifts, and communication was terrible. A supervisor would tell one person something. That person would repeat half of it to somebody else. And by lunch, the original instruction had acquired a different date, department, and reason. People got credit and blame for things they hadn't done all the time. I was also not the kind of employee anyone would naturally describe as helpful. That sounds worse than I mean it. I did my job. I trained new people when I was asked. If someone dropped a pallet, I helped pick it up. But I had spent 8 years working in places where agreeing to one favor somehow turned you into the permanent owner of that favor. If I covered your lunch once, I did not want to cover your lunch every Thursday until retirement. I kept my boundaries clear and, as a result, had a reputation for being a little unfriendly. I preferred that reputation. My coworker Elena once told me I had resting HR complaint face. I told her that was useful because people left me alone. Elena worked 2 aisles over from me and had been there almost as long as I had. She had 3 teenagers, packed enormous lunches, and treated every piece of workplace gossip like breaking national news. If somebody was sleeping with somebody, applying somewhere else, or crying in their car during lunch, Elena usually knew before their supervisor did. 2 days after Nina thanked me, Elena cornered me while I was counting boxes of wound dressings. You paid Devin back? I looked at her. For what? The birthday thing. I don't know what that means. His kid. I continued counting because we were already behind. Elena explained that one of our forklift drivers, Devin, had needed $40 for his son's birthday after his debit card got frozen. According to him, I had put cash in an envelope and left it inside his locker. That was not me. Had your name on it. What did it say? Elena lowered her scanner and tried to remember. Something like, don't make it weird. Pay me when you can. Katie. My name is Katie. That sounded enough like something I might write that I stopped counting. Did he pay me back? No idea. Good, because I didn't give him anything. Elena grinned. Secret philanthropist. I'm serious. So am I. If somebody wants to put your name on free money, put my name on the next one. I found Devin later that afternoon and asked about the envelope. He immediately reached for his wallet. I was going to get you tomorrow. I didn't give you $40. His hand stopped. Then who did? That's what I'm asking. He looked uncomfortable. The envelope had been inside his unlocked locker. He remembered my name being written on the front because he had thought it was strange that I knew about his problem. Who knew you needed money? A few people. Like who? He named 3 coworkers. None of them had any reason to involve me. I told him to keep the money. He tried to argue. I'm not taking $40 for something I didn't do. What if the person who actually gave it wants it back? Then they can tell you. Devin folded the bills back into his wallet. Still, that was nice of you. I literally just told you it wasn't me. I know. He smiled when he said it. That bothered me more than the envelope. The next one was harmless. A woman in packing thanked me for recommending a mechanic who had fixed her transmission for half what the dealership quoted. I had never heard of the mechanic. Another guy thanked me for telling the shift supervisor not to write him up after he overslept. A temporary worker I barely knew said I was the reason she had applied for a permanent position because apparently I had told someone she was good. Each time I corrected them, each time I got some version of the same response. Maybe I remembered wrong. Maybe somebody said I had suggested it. Maybe they thought the idea had come from me when it hadn't. Nobody seemed particularly concerned. I was not frightened yet, just irritated. I don't like being misunderstood. I especially don't like being thanked because thanking someone creates a tiny debt, and debts turn into expectations. If people thought I had lent money, covered shifts, and recommended them for jobs, eventually somebody would expect me to continue doing those things. I complained to Elena over lunch. She had brought leftover lasagna in a container large enough to serve a family. I had a yogurt and a bag of pretzels because grocery shopping had lost out to sleeping the night before. You know what your problem is? She asked. You care too much about being consistent. I have no idea what that means. It means normal people would just accept that everybody suddenly thinks they're nice. I am nice. Elena looked at my yogurt. Sure, I told her about Devon's $40. That got a more serious reaction. Okay, the money part is weird. Thank you. Could be someone screwing with you. Why? You're very easy to annoy. That's not a reason to give Devon $40. It might be to a rich person. Nobody in our warehouse was rich. For the next week, nothing happened. Then Marcus thanked me. Marcus was not a person who thanked employees casually. He was 40-something, had been promoted enough times to believe every conversation needed to sound managerial, and wore a Bluetooth headset even when it wasn't connected to anything. He found me near aisle 32. I appreciate you talking to Carlos. I thought he meant a work issue. About the damaged pallets? No, about him leaving. Carlos worked nights. I knew him well enough to say hello, but not much beyond that. Marcus told me Carlos had planned to quit without notice. Apparently, he had been having trouble at home, was exhausted by nights, and had received an offer at a distribution center across town. Somebody had convinced him to give management 2 weeks, so he wouldn't lose eligibility for rehire. Carlos said you talked him down. I've never had a conversation with Carlos longer than 30 seconds. Marcus laughed. Whatever you said worked. I didn't say anything. His smile faded. You sure? Yes. He looked at me for a moment, then gave a small shrug. Maybe he meant Elena. Elena and I do not look alike, I know. That evening, I found Carlos by the time clock. I asked whether he had told Marcus. I convinced him not to walk out. Carlos immediately looked embarrassed. Not exactly. What exactly? He told me he had been sitting in his car during lunch the previous Thursday, angry enough to leave his badge on the dashboard and drive away. Somebody had knocked on the passenger window. Who? I thought it was you. Thought? It was dark. The parking lot behind the warehouse had terrible lighting, but not so terrible that I liked the answer. Carlos explained that he never really saw the person's face. He rolled his window down a few inches. Whoever stood outside told him not to throw away 8 years over one bad month and said that if he wanted to quit, he should at least leave clean. What did they sound like? Carlos stared at me. You. I felt an unpleasant pressure in my chest. Did they say my name? No. Did you say mine? I don't remember. I hated that answer, although I understood it. Carlos had been angry, tired, and sitting in a dark parking lot. He hadn't known there would later be a reason to memorize the interaction. I asked what the person was wearing. A coat. What kind? Katie, I don't know. A coat. He was getting annoyed. I apologized. Carlos softened. Look, maybe it wasn't you. I just assumed. Why? He gave the question some thought, because it sounded like something you'd say. That was ridiculous. I would never have walked into the employee parking lot on my lunch break to comfort somebody I barely knew. What bothered me was that Carlos believed I would. The next morning, I came into work and found a box of donuts on the inventory desk with a note thanking me for everything. Nobody had signed it. I threw the note away. I ate one of the donuts. That probably sounds stupid, but I'm being honest. Something had started changing around me, and not all of it was unpleasant. People who had previously avoided me began saying hello. Nina brought me coffee. Devon started helping whenever inventory needed a pallet moved. A woman in shipping invited me to a barbecue. Marcus stopped questioning me every time I requested overtime. I had spent years being the person coworkers respected mostly because I didn't bother them. Now they seemed to like me. I knew some of it was based on things I had never done. I also knew correcting everyone wasn't fixing anything. So I stopped correcting the small ones. If somebody thanked me for bringing food to a sick coworker, I said I hoped she felt better. If someone thanked me for recommending them for a shift change, I said no problem. When Marcus thanked me for organizing a collection for an employee whose father had died, I didn't tell him I had contributed exactly $10. After Alina shoved the envelope into my hand, it became easier. Alina noticed. You're accepting your sainthood. I'm tired of arguing. Same thing. It is not. She smiled. People like you now. I know. You like that. I told her to eat her lunch. She laughed for a long time. The thing is, she was right. I didn't suddenly become generous or social, but work got easier once everyone believed I was. People forgave me faster when I was short with them. They assumed I was busy rather than rude. If I forgot something, somebody covered for me. Coworkers brought me food without asking what I wanted, and somehow usually got it right. The fake version of me had better relationships than I did. I started borrowing them. Then, one Tuesday, Nina came to me crying. Her daughter had been sick again, worse this time. Nina had missed too much work already and had been told another absence could lead to termination. She hugged me before I knew what was happening. Thank you. I froze. For what? She pulled back. For talking to Marcus. I felt my stomach drop. I didn't talk to Marcus. Her expression changed. Katie, I'm serious. You said it was handled. When? Yesterday. I wasn't here yesterday. You called me. I looked at her. Nina wiped her face. You called me at home. I had spent Monday on my couch eating cereal at 4 in the afternoon and watching a documentary I barely remembered. I didn't call you. She stopped crying for the first time since all of this started. Somebody else looked scared. What do you mean? I asked what number had called her. She pulled out her phone. The call history showed my name because my number was saved in her contacts. I looked at the time, 7:42 p.m. My phone had been beside me all evening. Nina stared at my face. But I talked to you. I didn't know what to say. She described the conversation. Whoever called told her that Marcus knew about her daughter and that she could stay home Tuesday without worrying about her attendance record. Nina had thanked the person. The person had replied, "You'd do the same for me." That didn't sound like me. Not because I wouldn't say something kind, because I would never assume Nina would do the same for me. I asked whether she had called Marcus. No. You said you already handled it. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. Nina, you need to call him. She did. Marcus had no idea what she was talking about. Part 2, Nina didn't lose her job. Marcus removed the attendance point after she explained what had happened. Although I could tell he didn't fully believe either of us. He kept asking whether I had perhaps called Nina and forgotten, which annoyed me enough that I eventually told him I was 33, not 93. He asked whether somebody had access to my phone. I said no. He suggested changing my password. I did. That was the closest I came to investigating anything. I didn't start checking phone records or asking IT to trace messages. I didn't make a spreadsheet of incidents or start interviewing coworkers. I had no desire to become the person responsible for solving whatever was happening. I wanted it to stop, and I thought that if I stopped participating in the version of me everyone else had built, eventually the whole thing would collapse from lack of attention. So I went back to correcting people every single time. If someone thanked me, I asked exactly what for. If I hadn't done it, I said so. Sometimes people laughed. Sometimes they looked irritated. A few looked hurt. Devon was one of them. He thanked me one morning for talking to his landlord. I nearly dropped my scanner. Why would I talk to your landlord? He said somebody from work called and explained why my rent was late. I don't know your landlord. Devon's face tightened. Okay. I'm not saying you're lying. Sounds like it. I'm saying it wasn't me. He shoved a pallet jack harder than necessary and walked away. That was when I discovered something I hadn't considered. People preferred the other Katie. The other Katie lent money without embarrassing anybody, talked people out of quitting, remembered sick children, handled problems before being asked, and apparently called landlords on behalf of coworkers. I was the woman standing in front of them saying none of that had happened. It started to feel as if I was taking things away. Even Elena got frustrated. You know I believe you, right? Do you? Yes. But sometimes maybe just let it go. You were the one who said this was weird. It is weird. Then why should I let it go? Because Devon's landlord gave him another week. That has nothing to do with me. I know. Elena stirred sugar into her coffee, but he thought somebody cared enough to help him. I stared at her. So I should pretend. I'm saying I don't know if correcting every good thing is helping anybody. That conversation stayed with me because I disliked her answer and couldn't completely dismiss it. For several weeks, the false favors remained small. Somebody left groceries outside a coworker's apartment and signed my name. A woman received flowers after a miscarriage with a card from me. Marcus claimed I had volunteered to help train a group of new hires. I refused that one. The fake Katie could have it. I started wondering less about who was doing these things and more about what they wanted me to become responsible for. That sounds analytical when I write it now. At the time, it was more like dread. Whenever someone walked toward me smiling, I began hating the phrase, "thank you." If someone said it at work, my first reaction was no longer politeness. It was, "What did I do now?" The most uncomfortable incident happened with a man named Ben. Ben worked second shift in quality control. We had never been friends, but I knew his wife had left him the previous year because Elena had told me, along with everybody else's personal business. One night, he waited beside my car after work. I almost turned around and went back inside. Ben raised both hands when he saw my face. "Relax. I'm not trying to scare you. You are standing beside my car at 11:30. I just wanted to say thanks." My shoulders dropped. "What for?" He smiled. "For telling me not to send it." I didn't know what he meant. His smile disappeared. Ben explained that he had written a long message to his ex-wife. According to him, it was angry enough that sending it probably would have caused problems with their custody arrangement. He had shown it to me. "No, you didn't." "Yes, I did." "When?" "Saturday. I don't work Saturdays." Ben blinked. He said we had talked outside behind the loading docks. I told him I hadn't been there. He became defensive almost immediately. "I know who you are." "I'm not saying you don't. You read the message." "I didn't. You told me to delete it." "I've never seen it." Ben stepped away from the car. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he took out his phone and opened the message thread with his ex-wife. The draft was gone. "I deleted it because you told me to." "I'm glad you deleted it." His eyes snapped up. "Don't do that." "Do what?" "Don't tell me you're glad after saying you weren't there." I understood why that sounded wrong. He put the phone away. "You were wearing that gray coat." I owned a gray coat. Half the women in Indiana owned a gray coat. I told him again it wasn't me. Ben left without thanking me. I sat in my car for almost 10 minutes before turning it on. The next morning, Elena asked whether I was okay. I told her about Ben. She listened while eating a blueberry muffin, then asked a question I hadn't expected. "Does anybody ever thank you for something bad?" I thought about it. "No. Everything fake you does is nice. Apparently." "That's weird." I laughed. "That's the part you think is weird." "You know what I mean." I did. Whoever or whatever was responsible had not tried to get me fired, humiliate me, or steal from me. It had made me more popular. It had helped people I worked with. Even Nina's situation had ended well once Marcus understood. If it was somebody's idea of a prank, the joke had gone on far too long and cost them money. If it was one person trying to impersonate me, they were doing an absurd amount of unpaid emotional labor. Elena asked whether I wanted her to stop telling me about things people said I had done. I surprised myself by saying yes. For a while, that helped. I went to work, counted inventory, and went home. If someone thanked me, I said, sure, unless the situation sounded serious. I stopped asking Elena what people were saying. The warehouse began feeling normal again. Because I allowed it to. That is the part I feel guilty about. I had learned that pretending was easier. Then Marcus called me into his office on a Thursday morning and closed the door. There was another man inside from corporate HR. I knew immediately that something was wrong. The HR representative introduced himself as Paul and asked me to sit down. Marcus wouldn't look at me. Paul asked whether I knew a temporary employee named Leah Morton. I recognized the name but barely knew her. She worked in packing and had been there maybe 3 months. Paul asked whether Leah had spoken to me about one of the shift supervisors. No, Never? Not that I remember. Paul wrote something down. He asked whether I had advised Leah to document inappropriate comments from the supervisor. No. Did you tell her other employees had complained? No. Did you tell her you would support her if she made a formal report? I felt my pulse start beating in my throat. No. Paul stopped writing. Leah says you did. I looked at Marcus. He still wouldn't meet my eyes. I told him about the things that had been happening. Not all of it. Enough. People thanking me for conversations I hadn't had. Nina receiving the phone call. Ben talking to someone he thought was me. The money, the favors, the shift changes. Paul listened without interrupting. When I finished, he asked whether I had reported any of this before. I said no. That answer sounded terrible as soon as I heard it. Marcus finally spoke. You told me about Nina. That was one incident. Paul asked how many there had been. I don't know. More than 5? Yes. More than 10? I hesitated. Yes. He leaned back. And you never reported that someone might be impersonating you. I didn't know that somebody was. What did you think was happening? I didn't want to deal with it. That was the truth. Paul stared at me for a moment. Then he told me Leah had filed a harassment complaint against her supervisor. The company was investigating. Several employees had supported parts of what she described, so she wasn't lying? That's not what I said. But other people complained? Yes. I felt a little relief. Then Paul continued. Leah had delayed filing the complaint for weeks because the person she believed was me had told her to wait while Katie gathered the others. Nobody had gathered anyone. Leah had continued working under the supervisor because she thought I was helping her. I felt sick. Is she okay? Paul's expression changed slightly. She quit yesterday. I asked why. He said he couldn't discuss everything. I knew enough from the way Marcus was sitting that it had gone badly. After the meeting, I found Elena in the break room. I told her what happened. She put her lunch down without opening it. For how long? Weeks. And she thought you were helping? Yes. Elena covered her face with both hands. I expected her to say it wasn't my fault. She didn't. Instead, she asked, why didn't you tell somebody this was still happening? I got angry immediately. I told you. I mean HR, Marcus, somebody. I didn't know Leah was involved, but you knew somebody was pretending to be you. I didn't know that, Katie. She said my name in a way I hated. I started listing all the reasons I hadn't reported it. Most of the favors were harmless. People were happier. Nobody had gotten hurt. Every explanation sounded weaker after I said it. Elena finally interrupted. You liked it. I stopped. You liked everybody thinking you were better than you are. That hurt because it was true enough to make defending myself pointless. I left the break room. I took the rest of the day off. Leah never came back. The supervisor she had reported was eventually fired. I learned that through Elena months later. Apparently, the company substantiated complaints from several women. That should have made me feel better. It didn't. Leah had spent weeks believing somebody was standing beside her. Nobody was. I resigned before the investigation into my part of the situation finished. Corporate didn't accuse me of impersonating myself, obviously. They treated it as some mixture of account security, workplace communication, and misconduct by an unknown employee. Paul asked me to stay while they sorted things out. I said no. I had already spent too long letting people tell me who I was. Elena hugged me on my last day. She cried. I did not. She handed me a grocery bag filled with snacks she knew I liked and said people had taken up a collection. I almost refused it. Then I asked, whose idea was this? Mine. You're sure? She laughed through her tears. Yes, asshole, I'm sure. I took the bag. I work somewhere else now. It's a small office, 11 people total. Nobody knows anyone from the warehouse. I don't lend money. I don't organize collections. I don't cover shifts unless I actually agree to it. I have been there 8 months, and I think most of my coworkers consider me polite and private. That is fine with me. A few weeks ago, though, our receptionist stopped me near the elevators. Her name is Grace. She looked embarrassed. Hey, I meant to thank you. I felt the same cold feeling I used to get at the warehouse. For what? The note. What note? She smiled. The one you left on my desk yesterday. I had been working from home yesterday. I asked what it said. Grace laughed softly. Nothing dramatic, just that I shouldn't let one bad week convince me. I'm bad at my job. I looked at her. She must have noticed something in my face because her smile disappeared. What? I asked whether the note had my name on it. No. Then, why do you think it was from me? Grace looked confused. I don't know. She thought about it for a few seconds. Then she said something I have been trying not to think about ever since. It just sounded like you. She went back to her desk. I didn't correct her. I wish I could say that was because I had learned nothing. The truth is worse. For a second, it felt good again. Nina didn't lose her job. Marcus removed the attendance point after she explained what had happened, although I could tell he didn't fully believe either of us. He kept asking whether I had perhaps called Nina and forgotten, which annoyed me enough that I eventually told him I was 33, not 93. He asked whether somebody had access to my phone. I said no. He suggested changing my password. I did. That was the closest I came to investigating anything. I didn't start checking phone records or asking IT to trace messages. I didn't make a spreadsheet of incidents or start interviewing coworkers. I had no desire to become the person responsible for solving whatever was happening. I wanted it to stop. And I thought that if I stopped participating in the version of me everyone else had built, eventually the whole thing would collapse from lack of attention. So I went back to correcting people. Every time somebody thanked me, I asked exactly what for. If I hadn't done it, I said so. Sometimes people laughed because they thought I was being strange. Sometimes they became irritated. A few looked almost hurt. Devon was one of them. He thanked me one morning for talking to his landlord. I nearly dropped my scanner. Why would I talk to your landlord? He said somebody from work called and explained why my rent was late. I don't know your landlord. Devon's face tightened. Okay, I'm not saying you're lying. Sounds like it. I'm saying it wasn't me. He shoved the pallet jack harder than necessary and walked away. That was when I started understanding something I hadn't considered before. People preferred the other Katie. The other Katie lent money without embarrassing anyone. She talked people out of quitting. She remembered when their kids were sick, recommended them for better positions, protected them from attendance points, and apparently called landlords on their behalf. I was the woman standing in front of them saying none of it had happened. Correcting them began to feel less like defending myself and more like taking something away. Even Elena got frustrated with me. We were eating lunch in the break room when she said, "You know I believe you, right? Do you?" "Yes, but sometimes maybe just let it go. You were the one who said this was weird." "It is weird." "Then why should I let it go?" "Because Devon's landlord gave him another week. That has nothing to do with me." "I know." She stirred sugar into her coffee for far longer than necessary, but he thought somebody cared enough to help him. I stared at her. "So I should pretend." "That's not what I said. It's pretty close." Alina sighed. "I'm saying I don't know if correcting every good thing is helping anybody." I disliked that answer enough that I kept thinking about it. For several weeks, the false favors remained small enough that ignoring them was easier. Someone left groceries outside a coworker's apartment and signed my name. A woman received flowers after a miscarriage with a card saying they were from me. Marcus claimed I had volunteered to help train several new hires. I refused that one. The fake Katie could train them. The rest I mostly let pass. I started wondering less about who was doing these things and more about what I would supposedly have done when somebody approached me smiling. That sounds more deliberate now than it was. At the time, it was mostly dread attached to the words, "thank you." If someone said them at work, my first thought was no longer politeness. It was wondering what I had done this time. The most uncomfortable incident before everything really went wrong involved a man named Ben, worked second shift in quality control. We had never been friends, but I knew his wife had left him the previous year because Elena knew everybody's personal business and apparently believed facts expired if she didn't repeat them frequently. One night, Ben was waiting beside my car when I left work. I stopped several yards away. He immediately raised both hands. Relax. I'm not trying to scare you. You are standing beside my car at 11:30 at night. Fair. He stepped away from the driver's door. I just wanted to say thanks. The familiar feeling returned. For what? For telling me not to send it. I had no idea what he meant. His smile disappeared. The message. What message? Ben explained that he had written a long text to his ex-wife a few days earlier. He was angry about something involving their custody arrangement, and from the way he described the message, sending it probably would have made his situation worse. He had shown it to me. No, you didn't. Yes, I did. When? Saturday. I don't work Saturdays. Ben blinked. He said we had talked behind the loading docks during his lunch break. I told him I hadn't been there. He became defensive almost immediately. I'm not saying you don't. You read the whole thing. I didn't. You told me to delete it. I've never seen it. Ben stepped farther away from my car. Neither of us spoke for a few seconds. Then he took out his phone and opened the message thread with his ex-wife. The draft was gone. I deleted it because you told me to. I'm glad you deleted it. His eyes moved straight back to mine. Don't do that. Do what? Don't tell me you're glad after saying you weren't there. I understood why that bothered him. He put his phone away. You were wearing that gray coat. I owned a gray coat. So did half the women in Indiana. I asked whether he had seen the person clearly. Ben's face hardened again. I wasn't examining you. I know. It was dark. We talked for maybe 5 minutes. What did I say? You told me I was trying to make her feel as bad as I felt, and that once I sent the message, I couldn't pretend it was about the kids anymore. I had no response. It was good advice. It was also not something I remembered ever saying to anybody. Ben watched me for another moment before asking, "Are you fucking with me?" No. Then somebody who looks like you knew what was in my phone. I don't know. He laughed without humor. Yeah, great. He left without thanking me again. I sat in my car for close to 10 minutes before turning on the engine. The next morning, Elena asked why I looked terrible. I told her about Ben. She listened while eating a blueberry muffin, then asked something I hadn't considered. Does anybody ever thank you for something bad? I thought about it. No. Not even something petty? No. Everything fake you does is nice. Apparently. Elena peeled the paper away from her muffin. That's weird. I laughed. That's the part you think is weird? You know what I mean. I did. Whoever was responsible had never tried to get me fired, steal from me, or humiliate me. They had made me more popular. They had spent money on other people. Even Nina's problem had ended well once Marcus understood what happened. If it was a prank, somebody had been maintaining it for months and spending enough money to make the joke expensive. If it was one person pretending to be me, they seemed to spend most of their time doing unpaid favors for people I barely knew. I didn't have an explanation that made sense. Elena asked whether I wanted her to stop telling me whenever somebody mentioned something I had supposedly done. I surprised myself by saying yes. For a while, that helped. I went to work, counted inventory, argued about bad quantities, and went home. If someone thanked me, I said, sure, unless the situation sounded serious. I stopped asking Elena what people were saying. The warehouse began feeling normal again because I allowed it to. That is the part I feel worst about now. I had learned that pretending was easier. Then Marcus called me into his office on a Thursday morning and closed the door. Another man was already sitting there. He introduced himself as Paul from corporate HR. I knew before either of them said anything that something had gone wrong. Paul asked me to sit. Marcus wouldn't look directly at me. Paul opened a folder and asked whether I knew a temporary employee named Leah Morton. I recognized the name but barely knew her. She worked in packing and had been at the warehouse perhaps 3 months. I know who she is. Has Leah ever spoken with you about one of the second shift supervisors? No, never. Not that I remember. Paul wrote something down. Did you ever advise her to document inappropriate comments or behavior from that supervisor? No. Did you tell her other employees had complained about him? No. Did you tell her that if she made a formal report, you would support her? My pulse had begun beating high in my throat. No. Paul stopped writing. Leah says you did. I looked at Marcus. He kept staring at his desk. I told them about the incidents, not every small favor. Enough. People thanking me for conversations I hadn't had. Nina getting a phone call from my number. Ben talking to somebody he believed was me. Devin's envelope. Carlos in the parking lot. Paul listened without interrupting. When I finished, he asked when it had started. Months ago. And you reported none of this. I told Marcus about Nina. Marcus finally looked at me. You told me about the phone call. Yes. You didn't tell me there were dozens of other things. I didn't know there were dozens. Paul asked, more than 5? Yes. More than 10? I hesitated. Yes. He placed his pen on the folder. You believed somebody might have been impersonating you at work and didn't report it? I didn't know somebody was impersonating me. What did you think was happening? I wanted to give him a better answer. Instead, I said, I didn't want to deal with it. The room became very quiet. Paul leaned back. Then he explained what had happened with Leah. She had filed a formal harassment complaint against one of the shift supervisors. Several other women had since reported similar behavior, and the company was investigating. So she wasn't making it up. That isn't the problem. But there were other complaints. Yes, some of the pressure in my chest eased. Then Paul continued. Leah had apparently first spoken about the harassment weeks earlier to someone she believed was me. The person had told her to document everything and wait before making the formal complaint because Katie was gathering the other women. No one had been gathering anyone. Leah believed I had spoken with several employees and was preparing to support her, so she waited. She continued working under the supervisor. I asked, for how long? Paul looked down. Several weeks. Is she okay? He paused before answering. She resigned yesterday. I asked why. He told me he couldn't discuss all of the details because the investigation was ongoing. I could tell enough from Marcus's expression that something else had happened between Leah and the supervisor during those weeks. I felt sick. She thought I was helping her. Yes, I didn't even know. Paul didn't answer. After the meeting, I found Elena in the break room. She was sitting at the table with her lunch still inside its insulated bag. I told her about Leah. She didn't interrupt. When I finished, she asked, how long did she think you were helping her? Weeks. Elena rubbed both hands over her face. And nobody actually was? No. Jesus. I waited for her to tell me I couldn't have known. She didn't. Instead, she asked, why didn't you tell somebody this was still happening? I became angry immediately. I told you. I mean HR. Somebody who could actually do something. I didn't know Leah was involved. But you knew people were talking to someone who looked like you. No, I knew people were confused. Katie. I hated the way she said my name, like I was deliberately making myself stupid. I started listing reasons. Most of the incidents had helped people. Nobody seemed hurt. Some of them could have been misunderstandings. There was no one person I could accuse. I had no proof that all the incidents were connected. Every explanation sounded worse once it was outside my head. Elena listened until I ran out. Then she said, you liked it. I stopped. What? You liked everybody thinking you were this person. That has nothing to do with Leah. It has everything to do with why you stopped correcting people. I felt my face get hot. That's bullshit. Is it? I stood up. Elena didn't. She looked tired rather than angry. You spent years complaining nobody here appreciated you. Then suddenly everybody thinks you lend people money, buy them groceries, help with their kids, and fix their problems. I never asked for that. No, she nodded. But once it started, you didn't want it to stop. That hurt because it was close enough to the truth that I didn't know how to argue without lying. I left the break room. I took the rest of the day off. Leah never came back to the warehouse. The supervisor she reported was fired several months later. Elena told me that after I had already left. Corporate apparently substantiated complaints from multiple women. I thought knowing that would make the situation easier. It didn't. Leah had spent weeks believing someone was standing beside her. Nobody was. The fact that the person had given her good advice didn't change that. I resigned before corporate finished deciding what, if anything, to do about my part in the situation. Nobody accused me of impersonating myself. Officially, it became some combination of possible account misuse, workplace communication problems, and unidentified misconduct. Paul asked me to stay while they sorted it out. I said no. By then, walking through the warehouse had become unbearable. People still smiled at me. Some still thanked me. A few clearly knew about the HR investigation and looked away when I passed. I had spent months benefiting from a person who did not exist, and now I couldn't tell which relationships belonged to me. Elena hugged me on my last day. She cried. I didn't, mostly because crying in the employee entrance beside 3 pallets of cardboard would have felt ridiculous. She handed me a grocery bag filled with snacks, beef jerky, sour gummies, the pretzels I always bought from the vending machine, and 2 of the expensive protein bars I complained were too overpriced to justify. People took up a collection. I almost handed the bag back. Then I asked, "Whose idea?" "Mine." "You're sure?" Alina laughed through her tears. "Yes, asshole. I'm sure. I took it." That mattered more than I wanted to admit, because it was the first nice thing anyone had done for me in months that I knew belonged to the correct version of my life. I work somewhere else now. It's a small insurance office with 11 employees. I don't talk much about the warehouse. Nobody there knows Elena, Nina, Devin, or anybody else from my old job. I don't lend coworkers money. I don't organize collections. I don't volunteer for birthdays or meal trains, although I sign the cards if somebody puts one on my desk. When people ask for favors, I either say yes or no instead of trying to sound nicer than I am. I've been there 8 months. I think most people consider me polite and private. That is exactly what I wanted. A few weeks ago, our receptionist stopped me near the elevators. Her name is Grace. She's 24 and still apologizes every time she transfers a call incorrectly, even though nobody cares. She said, "Hey, I meant to thank you." My stomach tightened before I could stop it. "For what?" "The note." "What note?" "The one you left on my desk yesterday. I had worked from home the day before." I asked what it said. Grace smiled. "Nothing dramatic. Just that I shouldn't let one bad week convince me. I'm bad at my job." I looked at her. She must have noticed something because her smile faded. "What?" I asked whether the note had my name on it. "No." "Was it in my handwriting?" "I don't know your handwriting." "Then why do you think it came from me?" Grace looked confused. She thought about it for several seconds. Then she shrugged. "I don't know." I waited. She added almost apologetically, "It just sounded like you." Then she went back to her desk. I stood near the elevators for a while. I could have corrected her. I could have told her I hadn't written it and asked to see the note. I could have gone straight to HR and explained everything that happened at my previous job before this place had the chance to turn into the same thing. I didn't, not immediately, because for 1 second before the fear came back, something else happened first. It felt good.